Why is Mary the First called Bloody Mary? This is such a long story, let's just get comfortable. As you know, history remembers Mary I as this murderous monster who burned hundreds of her subjects at the stake for no other reason than having a different faith. And while that fact is true, I think you'll be surprised to learn that her nickname Bloody Mary stems from 100% propaganda. Alright, okay, don't swipe just yet, stick around. Let's look into the facts before you dismiss this. As we know, Mary I was the first ever woman to rule over England in her own right. Previously to Mary, this had just been appointed to men. Women were not deemed good enough to rule the country. So even before she inherited the throne, Mary was going to have to tread lightly so as not to piss off the country, because she was already set up for failure simply for being a woman. But before you tell me that actually a woman can be successful because Elizabeth I, her sister, ruled after her and her reign was quite glorious, let me just tell you that the propaganda against Mary actually began in Elizabeth's reign. And Elizabeth, being clever, used her sister as a very clear contrast to herself. And to quote Elizabethan propaganda, Elizabeth was the clear and lovely sunshine that dispersed the stormy and tempestuous weather of Queen Mary. This, as well as many other anti-Mary propaganda, was published all over England as soon as Elizabeth came to the throne. Because Mary's reign, though it started well, ended quite poorly, and Elizabeth wanted to have a clear separation from Mary's reign and her reign. And actually, despite being no bloodier than her grandfather Henry VII, her father Henry VIII, her brother Edward VI, or even Elizabeth I, Mary is now remembered as the bloody one, whereas none of the other Tudors are, despite her number of executions being far less than any of the other Tudor monarchs, as well as being the Tudor monarch to have pardoned the most rebels during her reign, 3,000 of which had been pardoned after rebelling against her during the Wyatt's Rebellion. However, it is of course a fact that she had about 288 Protestants burnt at the stake. And this is the fact that many people hold on to explain her bloody title. Except she was of course not the first monarch to have done this, because to the 16th century mindset, heresy was a poison that threatened not just the church but society as a whole, that had to be erased so as not to infect the society as a whole. All over Europe, the punishment for heresy was not only death, but also the total destruction of the heretic's body, so as to prevent their body parts to be used as relics. And Mary's choice of burning these heretics was completely standard practice for the period. But Elizabeth I, following Mary, had the advantage of seeing how this affected England. And she was savvy enough to change this during her reign, where heretics were no longer burnt at the stake, but, of course, they were still killed. But instead of burning, they were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Another key reason why Mary is remembered as Bloody Mary is due to the very staunch Protestant John Foxe, who published his anti-Catholic works, the Book of Martyrs, in 1563. And although this book covered early Christian martyrs, the medieval Inquisition, he really focused his attention on Mary I's reign. And out of the 57 illustrations the book had, 30 of those were various different illustrations of some of the executions that occurred during Mary's reign. So the image of Mary as this evil Catholic witch is literally being shoved down people's throats. And of course her successor Elizabeth, being a clever bitch, had this book printed and distributed all over the country, ordering them to be installed in every cathedral church, and church officials were even told to take copies home to let their servants and visitors read it. So while it is of course a fact that Mary I had 288 people burnt at the stake for their religion, this is actually no different to what any other monarch did at the time. And while of course other people's crimes don't diminish her crime, it is important to remember that this was the norm, and if we're going to call one of these Tudor monarchs bloody, we should call them all bloody or none, because in fact Mary was actually the least bloody of all the Tudor monarchs, as well as the more forgiving, as well as the fact that there was a lot of anti-Catholic, anti-Mary propaganda circling all over the country immediately after her death. And the fact that this propaganda is still being believed hundreds of years later, when multiple historians have debunked this, is kind of wild.